Hello and welcome to episode 576 of the Our Lady of Fatima podcast. It is my pleasure to be with you this evening. My name is Terrence M. Stanton. We are recording on Thursday, June 29th, 2023, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. I wanted to share with you a few words from Bishop Athanasius Schneider. I'm sure this has been published at more than one outlet, but this is from CatholicFamilyNews.com. The title is "The Prohibition of the Traditional Latin Mass is an Abuse of Ecclesiastical Power, and non-compliance with its prohibition does not, in fact, constitute disobedience." I think this is a very important topic that Bishop Schneider is dealing with. Number one, it's the traditional Latin Mass. I mean, what's more important than that in this life is how we worship the Lord, the manner we reverence him. But also, over the course of the last several decades, really, and this is something that was warned about by St. John Henry Cardinal Newman. Of course, he would have agreed with everything that came out at the First Vatican Council, but he was concerned when papal infallibility was declared that people would get a mistaken notion about papal infallibility and basically think the Pope's impeccable, that every utterance from his mouth is de fide and has to be believed by all the faithful. And his critics said, no, that will never happen. Well, guess what? That's basically is what happens. And people turn themselves into pretzels trying to twist everything that Pope Francis says, the Pope splainers as they're known, into making it orthodox. But you can't. You cannot square that circle. You cannot square so many things that Jorge Mario Bergoglio has said into Orthodox Catholic teaching. It's just not the case. And every interview that the Pope gives is not infallible. And the Mass, of course, is of the greatest significance. So Bishop Schneider is a great leader. God bless him. And this is what he had to say on the subject. Number one, the traditional Roman liturgy of the Mass was the liturgy of our Catholic ancestors. It was the form of the Mass with which most of the European nations, except some Eastern European countries in the Ambrosian and Mozarabic rites, all American nations, and most of the African, Asian, and Oceanian nations were evangelized. That's a tongue twister. He's absolutely right. And it's ironic that this pontificate, which produced a document called Traditionis Custodes, Guardians of Tradition, is doing everything possible to attack tradition. We need to defend the traditional Latin Mass. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, over a millennium. You're not defending tradition. You're not a guardian of tradition if you're attacking the traditional Latin Mass. That is positively Orwellian, and it needs to stop. Number two, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. Bishop Schneider here quotes Pope Benedict XVI. Absolutely. Pope Benedict XVI was a great defender of the traditional Latin Mass. I wish he would have abrogated the Novus Ordo and said, hey, guess what? This didn't work. We're going back to the TLM. We're going to scrap the Novus Ordo. It's my prayer that the next Pope will get rid of the Novus Ordo. The man who was allegedly a Freemason, Annibale Bugnini, was at the vanguard, at the forefront of producing the Novus Ordo in the late 1960s. And it has been an abysmal failure. What metric do you want to look at, friends? Baptisms, confirmations, marriages, people attending Mass, people going to confession, people believing that our Lord is truly present in his body, blood, soul, and divinity. Catholics voting as they should, meaning not voting for pro-abortion politicians. Catholics basically act the way everyone else does in society, and that shouldn't happen. We should be, as Dr. Peter Grafe says, a cannonball in the pit of the stomach of society. Society shouldn't be able to digest Catholics. we should move the culture, not the other way around. We shouldn't be moved by the culture. But since the 1960s, it's been the culture that's moving Catholics. And Catholics have just gone along with the tide. Chesterton said a living thing swims against the tide. It doesn't go along with it. Number 3, the problem with the new missal lies in its abandonment of an ever-continuous history before and after St. Pius V, and in the creation of a thoroughly new book, albeit compiled of old material. That was Pope Benedict as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Exactly. This is novelty. This is the church of the 1960s and 1970s. And instead of being timeless, we're perpetually stuck in the era of Peter, Paul, and Mary Church with ridiculous hymns and the horrifying communion in the hand. I have to respectfully disagree with Dr. E. Michael Jones. A tweet he sent out a couple months ago, he was basically complaining that Bishop Schneider talked about communion in the hand being the most troubling aspect of the modern church. Dr. Jones doesn't seem to think that's a big deal. Well, it is a very big deal, Dr. Jones. I sincerely doubt you're listening to this program, but if you ever do, sir, you are 100% wrong. Communion in the hand needs to stop. I've related this story before. My dad was an altar server back in the early 1960s at St. Thomas Aquinas in South Buffalo, a Catholic school which has since closed, but like so many other Catholic schools, because of lack of faith, lack of belief in what? Lack of belief in the real presence of the Eucharist. What became of that? Well, communion in the hand led to a lack of belief that Jesus is really there in his body, blood, soul, and divinity in the most blessed sacrament. But as I've stated before on Our Lady's podcast, my dad was an altar server. One time Holy Communion was dropped, and not my dad, but the other altar server who was there went to go pick it up with his hand, and the priest hit his hand and said, "Your hands aren't consecrated." How far we've come, how far we've fallen in those several decades since that story took place. Number 4, the new missal's publication was accompanied by a kind of prohibition of all that came before it, which is unheard of in the history of ecclesiastical law and liturgy. Again, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Yeah, you cannot prohibit the traditional Latin Mass. That is not possible. Number 5, again, a quote here from Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the late Pope Benedict XVI. I can say with certainty, based on my knowledge of the conciliar debates and my repeated reading of the speeches made by the council fathers, that this, i.e. the reform as it is now in the new missal, does not correspond to the intentions of the Second Vatican Council. In other words, Cardinal Ratzinger was at the forefront of Vatican II, and he can take his share of blame for what went down there. I think he kind of realized the error of his ways and didn't really fully understand. I think a lot of people who were of good intentions didn't really fully understand how the modernists in the church would take it and run with it. But was his take that the bishops and the cardinals at Vatican II did not want the traditional Latin Mass to go the way of the dodo bird, which is almost what has happened. Thank God for good men like Archbishop Lefebvre, who preserved the TLM. Number 6, the traditional Roman liturgy of the Mass was the liturgy of all the Latin Rite saints. This is Bishop Schneider who's speaking, whom we know at least during the entire last millennium. Hence, its age is millennial. Although commonly called the Tridentine Mass, the exact same form of the Mass was already in use several centuries before the Council of Trent, and that council asked only to canonize that venerable and doctrinally sure form of the liturgy of the Roman Church. So the traditional Latin Mass didn't just come about in the 1500s. It's sometimes referred to as the Tridentine Mass, the Mass of the Council of Trent. But what Bishop Schneider Bishop Schneider, is saying here is that the Council of Trent just put everything into order that had been already going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. In other words, it codified it and canonized it at Trent, which was called in large part because of the Protestant Revolution that took place. It was an answer to the Protestant revolt of Henry VIII, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin. Number 7. The traditional Roman liturgy of the Mass has the closest affinity with the Eastern rites in bearing witness to the universal and uninterrupted liturgical law of the Church. In the Roman Missal of St. Pius V, as in several Eastern liturgies, there are very beautiful prayers through which the priest expresses the most profound sense of humility and reverence before the sacred mysteries. They reveal the very substance of the liturgy. And those last few lines was a quote of Pope John Paul II. There's a beautiful complementarity, in other words, between the Eastern rites, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, for example, and the traditional Latin Mass. They're the two lungs with which the Church breathes. The Novus Ordo is a stranger. Believe Dr. Kwasniewski, we went through that on Our Lady's podcast, talks about there being two brothers and a stranger here when we talk about the traditional Latin Mass being a brother of the Eastern rites, the Eastern liturgies, and then the Novus Ordo being an interloper, being something that was created out of whole cloth by, once again, a man who was alleged to be a Freemason in the late 1960s. That is not tradition, and that certainly is not guarding tradition. That is just creating something new for the sake of creating something new. And some people, their minds and hearts known only to the Lord, but some people within the Church were actively trying to undermine faith in Jesus Christ. We're actively trying to change the Church. Number 8, the Pope and the bishops do not have, therefore, the authority to forbid or to limit such a venerable form of the Holy Mass, which was offered by the saints for over 1,000 years, in the same way as the Pope or the bishops would not have the authority to forbid or significantly reform the venerable form of the Apostolic or Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, precisely because of their venerable, continuous, and millennium-old use. Well, that's exactly right. It's not the Church of Pope Francis. It's not the Church of Pope Benedict XVI. It's not the Church of Pope St. Pius X or any other pope. All right. The Church is the bride of our Lord Jesus Christ. We're not to tamper with it. We're not to mess around or make novelties or anything like that, come up with our own Mass out of nothing. We're supposed to hand down what was given before us. The apostles handing down to the bishops, who handed down to the bishops after them, to the bishops after them, down to the present group of bishops. That's what apostolic succession is. We're not to tinker with things like we're doing some sort of junior high school chemistry experiment. Number 9, complying with the abusive prohibition of that venerable form of the Mass of the Saints, issued unfortunately by current churchmen in a time of unprecedented ecclesial crisis, would constitute a false obedience. And this gets back to the heart of what St. Newman warned about. You have to do everything the Pope says to do just because he's the Pope. It has to be in accordance with tradition. The Pope's number one job is to defend the faith, to hand down the sacred deposit of faith. Well, in the 20th century, we lost that big time, especially at Vatican II and thereafter, and changing the Mass and basically trying to eliminate the traditional Latin Mass from the face of the earth, which will never happen. That's never, ever going to happen, but it certainly has been limited a great deal. That's not the job of the Pope. That's not defending the faith. That's attacking the faith. Number 10, non-compliance with the prohibitions of the traditional Mass does not make one, by that fact, schismatic, provided one continues to recognize the Pope and the bishops and continues to respect them and pray for them. I think this might be a nod here to the Society of St. Pius X. Many people still falsely accuse the Society of St. Pius X for being schismatic. Absolutely not. As I've stated before on Our Lady's podcast, some of the holiest priests that I've encountered were affiliated with the Society of St. Pius X. And they pray for the Pope at every Mass. They are not schismatic. You can fulfill your Sunday obligation, your Holy Day obligation by attending an SSPX Mass. And I highly recommend you go to them for confession too. I've gone to the SSPX on a couple occasions for confession and found some of the best spiritual guidance I've ever received. That's what Archbishop Lefebvre wanted to do. He wanted to form holy priests. And that's exactly what the Society of St. Pius X has done. I know not every society or religious order is perfect, and there are bad apples everywhere, but the Society of St. Pius X has done a better job of handing down the faith and molding good priests than any other religious order. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Number 11, in disobeying formally such an unheard of prohibition of an inalienable patrimony of the Roman Church, one in fact obeys the Catholic Church of all ages and all the popes who diligently celebrated and commanded the preservation of that venerable and canonized form of the Mass. Exactly. You can't have a situation where this Mass was the norm for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, was praised by numerous popes and saints, and then suddenly it's bad. That's childish. That's ridiculous. That's stupid. That makes no sense whatsoever. We have to use the brains that the good Lord gave us to think and not just follow what a wayward pope says, like automatons. Number 12, the current prohibition of the traditional rite of the Mass is a temporary phenomenon and will cease. The Roman Church is experiencing today a kind of liturgical exile, i.e., the traditional Latin Mass has been exiled from Rome, yet the exile will, for sure, one day come to an end. There's a great sense of hope here in what Bishop Schneider is saying. It's like, Pope Francis is getting on in years, and whether he lives another 5 weeks or another 5 years, his time is short. He will die and he will be replaced with a new pope. God willing, the next pope will be a great saint, and he will eliminate the Novus Ordo and restore the traditional Latin Mass to its rightful place of honor and glory in the Church. Number 13, since the traditional Latin Mass has been in uninterrupted use for more than a millennium, sanctified by universal reception over time, by the saints and by the Roman pontiffs, it belongs to the inalienable patrimony of the Roman Church. Consequently, in the future, the Roman pontiffs will without doubt once again recognize and reestablish the use of that traditional liturgy of the Mass. Again, emphasizing that this is temporary, folks. There's been a lot of talk about a new springtime, but for the last 50 years, actually more like 60 years in the Church. Once again, going back to my dad was an altar boy at St. Tommy's back in the early 1960s. Roughly since that time, we're not going to blame my father for this, but roughly since that time, and Vatican II, and in the wake of Vatican II, it's really been a winter in the Church. It's been a time of trying. It's been a time, however, that hopefully will raise up great saints, great reformers in the Church, true reformers who know that true reform means returning to apostolic tradition. Finally, number 14 here, Bishop Schneider says, future popes will thank all priests and faithful who in difficult times, notwithstanding all pressures and false accusations of disobedience, and in a spirit of sincere love for the Church and for the honor of the Holy See, maintained and transmitted the great liturgical treasure of the traditional Mass for future generations. This is echoing something that the late great Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre said. Future generations will see, will remember, history will note the Catholics who stood up for tradition, the bishops, the priests, the laymen who stood up and fought for the traditional Latin Mass. History will remember them as the heroes. And the men and women who attacked the traditional Latin Mass, the men and women who attacked the Rosary, the men and women who attacked traditional forms of piety, they will be seen for what they are, the villains. And in the end, God will judge all of us. God sees everything. It might seem like evil's winning in this world, but in the end, evil does not win. We know that good triumphs over evil. We know that our Lord Jesus Christ has won past tense, is winning present tense, and will win definitively when he comes again to judge the living and the dead. And the devil and the Antichrist and the false prophet all get pitched into the lake of fire forever. And that'll be it for the demons. They'll be tortured and humiliated for all eternity. And Jesus' victory will be definitive at the end of time. Last but not least here, a little bio of Bishop Schneider, Athanasius Schneider, ORC, born Anton Schneider on 7 April 1961, is a Kazakhstani Roman Catholic bishop, the auxiliary bishop of Astana, Kazakhstan. He is a member of the Canons Regular of the Holy Cross of Coimbra, holds a doctorate in theology and patristic sciences from the Augustinianum in Rome, and is the author of 2 books on the Holy Eucharist, Dominus Est, It is the Lord, and Corpus Christi, Holy Communion and the Renewal of the Church. Most recently, he published Christus Vincit. I read that book, highly recommend it. Christ's Triumph Over the Darkness of the Age, Angelico Press, 2019, a book-length interview conducted by journalist Diane Montaigne. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Goodbye, and God love you.